Hello everyone, good afternoon. Welcome to the second Angat Kabataan Open Grand Finals. So after 2 weeks of intense debating, now we're here. We're gonna witness the equal talk of this tournament. So before we proceed, hello everyone, my name is John Flores. I am the chair for this Open Grand Finals. And I would like for my other panelists to also introduce themselves starting from my left.
Sorry, hi guys, Green from the Ashford.
Hello guys, Nathaniel, one of your adjudicators for this final round.
Hi, my name is Manong. Hello, my name is Kaligan. What?
Good afternoon. My name is Allain.
Afternoon, Griswa. And for bookings, may the ads be forever in your favor.
And I would like for the debaters to just refer to the panel as a whole. But before that, I want to introduce the teams that were debating in the Open Grand Finals. In government, we have UPLB, the Odas. And in opposition, we have Nagasabiko. So I think we're din naman yung pupunta nila sa tayo kasi sila yung malayo yung So, yeah. Yeah. A few reminders before we start the debate. First is we don't implement the mandatory PI rule, but we know that you'll make this debate much interesting. You'll give and take POI. Second is please be mindful of speakers, opponent, POI purposes. Third is please be responsible with your timers. But I think that we have manual timers as well on our side, and please follow back with the rules and issue trigger content warning for any sensitive discussion. With that out of the way, I now call this house to order. Again, for observers in audience, if you can, please minimize your voice while the speech is ongoing. Debating on the motion, this house prefers a world where the country are never separated. I now call the Prime Minister to start the debate. Here.
Hello.
Hello, can we ask for assistance? Thank you.
Hello. Okay, so before I start my speech, I would just like to do a quick shout out. So shout out to the Parliament, of course, for allowing me to, venture to Bicol, and how did my family and friends supported me on this journey. How like I have Zali right now who's an alumni. This is yeah, stuff like that. Okay. Yeah, without further ado, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I am born in Quezon. I am not a Bicolana like all of you. In UPLB, when I introduce myself together with my hometown, they don't know where that is. My friend group, they think that Gumaka is inherently a funny name. This is not racist, sure, but it explains how in the instance that you are born for a moment or a time or the right place, wrong place, it determines your privileges and the standing already that comes with it. The first I want to do is on framing. The first piece of framing is what the world looks like when the Pangaea never separated. This looks like, A, there are no tectonic plates, no volcanoes, no mountains, no convergent space, which means that there's no separation of these communities. Or how B, humanity exists within a spectrum. They coalesce proximity-wise. So there's going to be no concept of, for example, Caucasoids, Negroids, Mongoloids, or how there's going to be less emphasis on biological differences, so there's less incentive for discrimination to proliferate or happen. On our side, you're more exposed to the same types of people, the same archetypes of people. You're probably going to meet someone and they probably look like you if Pangaea never separated. what status quo looks like present this separation. So the status quo looks like is how Caucasians in 10,000 years discovered fire and agriculture who rarely mingled with Negroids, with Mongoloids, because they're physically isolated after the last ice age. This means that the divide and separation that comes with the purging and separating it opens up for these communities to essentially diversify. We see that likely on our humans are to be more homogeneous. You probably look the same, or you have someone with the same characteristic traits because of your coexistence. The argument then that comes from government is where people will become more tolerant with one another. The purpose of this is a status quo to have racism, cultural divide, wars, Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, or wars that exemplify the diversity that exists within the spectrum, or how people are likely to be xenophobic precisely because of imperialism, colonialism. Why countries think they are better than others? Why there are metrics to solidify this margin, or how why even multi-regional conflicts exist, like Tagalogs and Visayas having this mini fight that is irrelevant or is going to be over-exemplified through TikTok debates, etc. Why is this important? What these things suggest is that biological differences pave the way for humanitarian harm, oppression, racism, xenophobia, violence, displacement, all the bad things you can think of. I don't have all the minutes or the time to explain what are the effects that are born out of this. So this not the limits of framing. It means that the inherent problems are born out of the tectonic plates separating how the world looks like right now. But yeah, we'll take the trade-off. Sure, if it were to be true that racism can exist in this world, we say it's going to be minimal because you won't find big things to oppress people if they don't look like you. So it's going to be, you're going to scour for reasons to oppress other people, and it's just not going to be likely that you're going to oppress people just because of your race, your ethnicity, or whatever protected attributes. But before, yeah, sure.
If there are no tectonic plates, then how does the Earth generate enough heat to sustain life, especially during the nighttime?
Yeah, this first debate space for a world reset motion. But obviously, sure, if you bite into that framing, like Pangea not diversifying, it just means that it's just going to not open to things such as racism, such as cultural divide, etc., etc. Like even if humanity stops there, we're content with that precisely because there's no discrimination existing. So the impact is threefold. The first is that it's easier to justify racism and colonialism because of these stark differences. So it's easier to brand Filipinos as savages or whites as to be pretty, or how necessarily it makes it okay to brand humans as less humans because they were unfortunately born on the wrong side, on the wrong continent, in the wrong time. So the second impact is how these oppressive systems reverberate over time. This means that, for example, systems like patriarchy, like colonialism, imperialism, to remain even with the impositions or the pushback that we have with movements. So it means that the harms are just already irreversible. All needs to prove why the irreparable, irreversible effects of this racism that provided harms to the ethnic communities, blacks, Latinos, Asians, even if they are just simply existing. So the third impact then is why it's just so normalized to the point of minorities fighting each other against the Tagalogs and Visayas, but how necessarily inter-regional conflicts exist, like Sami people in Finland, who necessarily, even if you exist under a parent country, you want to just diversify, you want to oppress your neighboring communities or ethnic regions just because you have the artillery and the power to do so. Why this is the most important part of the debate, I want you to listen closely. On the first point, economic prosperity or wars for whatever offsets that is a benefit out of this are reliant on the external factors that we cannot meaningfully derive from the motion. And even if you look at status quo right now, it's just that the harms are just so rampant, and you can see it, you can feel it if you are in another country and that people look at you weirdly, etc., etc. What this suggests is that one is the most certain benefit you're going to get on either side of the house, but secondly, even on the instance that it's contingent on Pangaea, and second that it's less likely to happen with wars, inequality that we posit, or how it's going to be better and more inclusive if there's going to be mitigatory responses and systems to solve this issue in place. This looks like you're going to ease up on, for example, immigration policies, because now they cannot say that these people are different precisely because of the biological differences that we pose, or how you all necessarily came from the same land. So necessarily, like if you exist under Pangea where everyone is the same, there's no major factor as to how you necessarily oppress the people, and therefore it's just more likely that we're going to protect minorities on our side, or how even that minorities are not going to even exist in the first place. So for all the reasons that I provide, thanks.
Speech. Ano, to introduce him using opposition, tapos the leader of opposition. Here.
Cool. So, hi everyone. Just a couple of quick shout outs. This is finals. So, of course, to OC and everyone who's dedicating a huge part of their weekend to welcome everyone here and make this tournament a huge success. We greatly appreciate it. To my teammates and everyone we love back home, thank you for their support as well. And we're really, really happy to just be here. The first time here, the trip was an odyssey and definitely an adventure, but happy to be here. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, if you think the United States of America is powerful, then imagine a singular, huge landmass and continent known as America. We believe, coming from side opposition, that across the 7 continents and over 195 other countries we have here on planet Earth, create diversity in and of itself, which is beautiful and amazing. Case in point that we all come from different provinces, and I'm sure we also all have friends coming from different parts of the world, that in and of itself make these things meaningful when we're able to meet and travel and put the effort for all these particular individuals. We also believe that, ironically enough, these differences actually create and protect us from the risk of a singular centralized authority, and actually create a mutually beneficial incentive structure to be able to coalesce, trade, and form communities that we have here in status quo. Make no mistake, this isn't some kumbaya thing where we think status quo is fine, but this debate is largely about extents. Meaning the extents of conflicts and the extents of things and differences that we have here are still things which happen, yes, many kinds of fragmented conflicts and many geopolitical concerns, but to a large extent, I'd like to believe that the world we have is relatively peaceful. Amidst all of these things we've had in the past 2 years, have we had World War III, boom, 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 all these things happen? I don't think so quite yet. A few things coming from our side of the house. Firstly, on their side, when there is no Pangaea, you likely have a singular centralized landmass that actually opens up the risk of centralized authority. Think about a proliferated reign of the Roman Empire or dynastic China. I understand that at some point these nations fell, similar to what Ray Dalio talks about, but it's probably going to take not just hundreds of years, maybe even thousands of years, or potentially longer. On both sides of the house, given that these things are going to still have conflict, we believe that the speed, the severity, and the extent of conflict is going to be bound up in these powers of domination that are likely to be worse on their side. A few reasons for that. Number one, the rise of central authorities and powers are going to be determined by these kinds of technologies. Developing the wheel. Whoever that develops the wheel first are going to be able to create these vehicles, to be able to travel far and wide, to be able to conquer these particular borders. We think in the world we have today, different countries were able to take their time creating the wheel and even had the innovation of having to have multi forms of transport like maritime and aircraft that slowed down the extent of this domination. The second technology are things like clothing to be able to withstand different climates and even weapons, meaning these particular countries who, by the way, discover these things first potentially become that ruling party to form that particular thing. The second thing is that it creates the literal division of in groups and out groups. And I hope you listen to this. Because the outer groups are going to be the ones who have control of water, ladies and gentlemen. These particular out groups who control the water are likely to be more developed and are likely to be able to control those things. Kawawa, yung mga tao na sa loob, the particular in-groups who are significantly farther in terms of proximity from these different water resources. That is to say, this doesn't involve water, it also involves the food the animals will eat. Because water, being the most important basic resource for life, is actually where these animals are going to congregate. That is to say, the outer groups are going to be the ones who are likely to be able to have that dominion and control that similarly make these things worse. Sure, sir.
So inequality still happens on your side. It's worse because now you have an extra layer to say that we actually deserve water because we're white and we're not.
We think that these happen in extents, and contrary to popular belief, things can get worse. That is to say, in status quo, given the diversity we see, create incentives because some people who have water resources who are near there, some people are in the mountains. But my question is, and I hope you can address this in your speech, is what incentive do these outlanders have to be able to deal with the people in the inland, given the already characteristics? The second thing I want to be able to explain is to talk about the environment. And I believe on their side of the house, we're likely to be able to have harsher climates, as I suggested in my point of information. Think about the movie 2012 or The Day After Tomorrow. It's precisely because you have a larger land of water around this landmass, which means that the temperatures and the extent of these things heating up and cooling down in the El Nino and La Nina season are going to significantly be wilder. If the people are talking about a super El Nino, on their side, they're going to have El Nino Pro Max fully paid. These things significantly are going to be more difficult, and the extent of people getting wrecked is harsher. We might not like those outlander guys who are rich and developed, who control food and water, but those people might potentially be wrecked by the tsunamis. The same way the people in the inland are definitely going to be affected by drought. Sure, go.
But this is just status quo bias. Obviously, this is a world reset. People would have evolved to acclimate themselves to the harsher climate.
We think that, yes, it's a world reset, but the extent of those particular things being compared, because this is a debate and we're of course going to be comparing it to status quo, we still have to be able to make those decisions to be able to give those metrics. We can't just say, yeah, bro, world reset going to be perfect, all good, all fine, they'll adjust. The comparative we have in this debate is status quo, and we simply say status quo is not perfect, but at least it's relatively things we can deal with. Why is that? Because the alliances and the trade talks that we form are things which transcend boundaries. It transcends borders. It transcends the geopolitical conflicts that we have. Case in point, things like ASEAN, things like OPEC. On their comparative, it's going to be bound through siege warfare, primarily by those people within your particular concentration. It's going to be based on proximity, and we think that undermines the diversity that in and of itself make life beautiful, and in and of itself create the differences that actually can become not just a unifying factor, but also something that is a check and balance against the bad things that happen. For all these reasons, we're very happy and proud to open and sign negative.
I thank your opposition for the fine speech. To extend the views of government and our Deputy Prime Minister, here.
Hello. Okay. While I'm arranging my notes, just a few shout outs. So the first one is that to the Bicol debate community, like the only reason why I'm here is because personally I'm from Naga, And I never really, like, I'm a quote unquote high school debater, but I never really got to experience debating as a high schooler here in Bicol. That's why I'm very, like, whenever there's an opportunity of a face to face debate tournament in Bicol, I would immediately like write my excuse letter tas pupunta, even though it's like a weekday, because I really love the community here. So, and also because hinila ako ni Zalby. Anyway, okay. Opposition has a status quo bias. Yes, we can just say that, yes, bro, this is a world reset because that's how this motion type works. You should read the UNADC manual. It's a world reset. This doesn't happen overnight. Meaning, we have yet to say that over the millennia of years that we were able to acclimate ourselves, the human body is able to develop along these harsher climates. So if much more harsher in the outlands, obviously people would migrate outside and more towards the outlands, towards where there's more water. Second, they don't explain why water on our world is important. The reason why water access is important in status quo is for you to get to the other continent, is for you to trade with the other continent. On our side, there's literally no point in going to the ocean because everything is connected within one continent. And this is why opposition immediately fails because they don't prove what happens on status quo. They don't prove why the rules of status quo right now applies to the very same thing that we have in Pangaea. They say that we have things like ASEAN, etc. We didn't need to have ASEAN if we were divided. We didn't need to solve racism if there's less racism on our side of the house. These are the things that they needed to prove on their side of the house. Second, in terms of centralized government, they don't explain why centralized government is bad. But second, I'm going to take them on their best, that even in the instance that we do have a centralized government, oftentimes a lot of the harms that they posit, such as slavery or oppression, are harder to justify as what Jill proves. Because oftentimes, if you're a unitary government and you want to enslave people, oftentimes it's harder to justify. That's why you need to come up with practical reasons to enslave people, and oftentimes those reasons are impractical. On their side, for you to enslave people, it's easy. You just brand a different group of people because they have isolated themselves and developed a different skin color and say they're less than human. And this is precisely the biggest harm on their side of the house. Because of the geographical isolation caused by the last ice age, people and humans have biologically evolved into different skin tones, different eye features, different facial features. That's why it's easier for bad faith actors to hijack these types of narratives, to divide the people so they're easier to conquer. Notice how the Spaniards branded us as savages, precisely because we're just different skin. And those narratives are much more harmful. And this is the most important aspect of the debate, as opposed to water access, as opposed to the outlanders versus inlanders. I think it's already too late coming from PLO to defend this. But yes, Dylan.
The Roman Empire and Chinese dynasties were one of the most violent periods in human history. How does that work exactly?
So who were they violent against? The people who are different from them. The Han Dynasty assimilated because they were different from other people. The Roman Empire killed Germanic tribes because they were Roman, they were Germanic. On our side, we're the same. That's the inherent difference. If wars happen on our side, oftentimes it's much more practical. It's because of resources, etc. When wars happen on their side, every bad actor has the active incentive to brand this as an ideological war. It's us versus them. It's because they're different from us. That's why wars on their side are bloodier. Soldiers have the incentive to commit much more war crimes, to do massive rapes, for example, precisely because they see themselves as less than human. What Jill proves in this debate is one, it's easier to justify oppression, meaning that it's more likely to happen. Things like imperialism is easier to justify because Filipinos are brown skinned, because people in Africa are dark skinned, for example. That's why they deserve much harsher treatment. But second is the fact that these systems transcend time. Notice how LO's mechanism of status quo is relatively fine, guys. Nothing Again, this is a world reset. You need to be able to outweigh all of the harms from 5,000 years of human history of racism, xenophobia, slavery, imperialism. They need to defend that on their side of the house. And why status quo outweighs this? Because some systems are irreversible. They're hard to dismantle. Structural racism habits exist in the United States. Racism and xenophobia still exist internally. We hate Bisaya, for example, for God knows what. Bisayas hate Tagalogs because for God knows what. Why? Because we were born in a different island group. That's precisely inherently abhorrent. But thirdly, opposition needs to outweigh the millennia of this thinking. They need to outweigh the millennia in history of racism. The millions of people have died because of this oppressive system. It's not enough for all to explain why there is an active incentive to be better than status quo. Because every minute, every day, month, year that goes by, these systems affect thousands of people, billions of people who have died because of these oppressive systems. On their side, the birth lottery has a wide variance because you can be born on the other side of the continent and be branded as less human. On our side, you're only born into one continent, meaning the variance of birth lottery is shorter, meaning there's less inequality at the very end of the day. They can't just say transcends borders because what they do is they justify the problem by selling you a solution. Notice their language. They say Allain exists and they say diversity is beautiful, but they pale in comparison to the fact that millions of people have said diversity is wrong, diversity is bad. Just look at the current president of the United States, POI.
Outlanders will be racist to inlanders because they have nothing to provide.
It's not food in the inland and people won't live there. There's no people in Antarctica on our side. See, again, this is a world reason. And if people will develop to migrate towards sea borders, if you really love the sea, dude, like, again, this is a world reset. This doesn't happen overnight. You're not gonna wake up tomorrow and win this grand champion and wow, there's only one continent. Again, you need to look at this in a world reset because that's what debate and what the two types possible. Why is there less racism? And this is the most important part of the debate. Because again, it's harder to group people and brand them. When it's harder to group people, it's harder to brand them as derogatory terms or attribute bad traits to them. And the impact of this is one, wars become less bloody. We prevent the wars that are based on differences. Oftentimes, the wars that are the most destructive in the first place, they're much more willing to attack civilians because they believe they're part of the problem. They're much more willing to kill babies because they believe they're part of the problem and grow up to different people. Second, we provide much better and more inclusive mitigatory responses due to wars because you're much more acclimated towards one another because humanity is more tightly knit community on our side of the house. They themselves said we're a unitary government. So it's reason to have inside. Meaning if we have only one government, then everyone has the incentive to work together. Meaning that on our side, you get more understanding, you have less reasons to deviate and break off. But even in the instance that you do, oftentimes it's for practical reasons. Opposition can merely win this debate precisely just because they didn't read the UADC manual.
Thank you for the welcome class of Deputy Prime Minister. To extend the case of opposition as well, welcome in the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Before I start, shoutouts. Because I tend to forget shoutouts usually. Shout out to OC. They've been very, very helpful to us, very welcoming. We love the experience here so far. Especially that was I like met some of them like only like like a month, 2 months ago, but I really feel like family. Of course, shout out to judges, for the judges were like very, very helpful giving us feedback. It's a really, really fun time. And of course, shout out to Depsop, my family, I say Depsop. Of course, they've been here with us, of course, and those who are supporting us all from home. I'll start my speech. In my speech, despite me from being northern and central Luzon, and then from being like the southern part of Luzon, and we're not divided by waters, by the way, I love these people. They've been the most enjoyable people I've been with, and because of that, I'm not gonna bully with insults like not reading BBC manual. Alright, so in my speech, I'm gonna be doing something simple. I'm gonna proceed to an abstract rebuttal on why there's large differences in this, more than just the heartland not arguing or the outside and insiders. Secondly, I'm going to explain to you why distance is such a beautiful thing that humanity has to explore. And if I have time, I'll extend as well on the environmental issues. Firstly, the first thing to say is that there's gonna be no people in the center or side. There's an nuance. Obviously, no one's gonna live on the absolute center. But for those who are in the rimland or in the waters, they'll force people to live at just the center, their fringes, and that's where discrimination starts. But I do believe that conflict is more than just geographic location. I want to do here explain when does conflict start instead of asserting that just because you are the same, there's no conflict. If I prove this extension then or this rebuttal then their entire case about conflict is a wash and explain the difference in margin of conflict. So we tend to ask sometimes that when do we integrate and segregate people? Sometimes we segregate people by gender. Sometimes we integrate them by race, for example, then. When does it create conflict? It does create some unity. Like all of us here being different, we aren't really just fighting each other, insulting each other. We still love each other. The reason is because when people are on the same lands, if they see each other eye to eye, that's where they become united. But if they still don't see each other eye to eye, they are far more likely to discriminate each other. I'm going to give you 3 reasons or 4 reasons why people are still largely different on their side of opposition. Government. Firstly, you're still going to have different skin color and explain this through evolutionary measures. If you notice, those closer to the equator are far more blacker than those who are on the northern south. The reason here is because the shape of the Earth is an oblate spheroid. So meaning if you're in the equator, you're closer to the sun. Which means that you have to receive more sunlight, which is damaging to you. Therefore, your skin color develops things like melanin, for example, in order to combat that as well. It's almost at the same time as well on the southern and northern part. Because you are far from the sun, you need to absorb more of the sunlight. Therefore, that's why white people on the northern part have to wear more things like what do you call this sunscreen, right? It's because it's might be harmful when you're going to other countries. Therefore, for those in the Pangaea, those who are closer to the equator are still largely black. Those who are in the south and the northern part, they're still largely white. Therefore, there's still race differences. This is scientific analysis, by the way, unless they have yes, POI.
So it was already explained by Jill that yes, skin colors still exist, but the fact that they can mingle each other because they're not geographically isolated by
Yeah, I agree. I'm gonna explain 3 more things. Secondly, you're not divided by waters, but you're divided by mountains. If you notice, North, Central, and South Luzon are not necessarily divided by water, but we speak different languages. Right? We still have different cultures. It's because distance in mountains is they're bigger separator here. What does it mean then? Meaning, they're still likely to have differences in how we actually grow up, how we have cultures, so you're likely to still have levels of discrimination against each other if there is discrimination. Lastly, and explain how the genetic differences. The way our bodies work scientific is that our bodies randomly mutate to adapt to different weather, for example. For example, if southern and northern parts are much more cooler, then there's probably more temperate parts in the east or the west, depending on which part of you are. Therefore, you're still likely to be very, very different based on how your body mutates randomly to adjust to specific things, which is what they're arguing about earlier and explained that as well. So what does this mean as the extension? Therefore, there's no level of homogeneity on their side that makes us too similar. But what we expected here is that the conflict argument just makes our different is a wash. What's the difference here? It was Joseph's argument. The fact that now, since we're not separated, whoever invents and monopolizes the wheel first gets to use the conflict and dominate everyone far more faster. Like Rome, for example, and Dynasty China. Notice they were not really separated by waters, but still had millions of people die. It is worse than status quo. Imagine the life of the entire Pangaea which can dominate based on their birth. You said they're separated by actual mountains. Sure, that's why if you have things like levers from your vehicles, you're able to better dominate these things. That's why you oftentimes place a lot of the entire bases in things like mountains, like if you want in China, even like Cordillera, because whoever has better technology can also cross the mountains. What does it mean? If we have enemies in conflict, they dominate faster, they dominate more badly. This means you as a babaylan in the Philippines never get to become a babaylan because Rome already conquered you before they can invent things like the boat, for example, then. This also means that then, under your side, you don't get to be gay, for example, because you've already discriminated you very, very easily because they can travel to you faster. So if it's a worst case we're comparing where people are really, really discriminatory then, and we still have it proven empirically that we have differences, they do it faster, we have less time to prepare. We, as the Filipinos, when the Spaniards came, we're not just savages. We had weapons to defend against them and even kill specific people that are key to this colonialism. So we were able to do that because even though they were a bit more advanced in weaponry back then, we had time to develop this to defend ourselves, time to develop civilizations, be able to make sure we can defend ourselves on water power, for example. Then that's the reason why we can defend ourselves on our side because you have more time to defend and generate your civilizations for defense. So they have to engage in their worst case here. Otherwise, they want to deny facts, for example. Then I'm not sure if that's going to work then. Therefore, why is this enough to win the debate? Simply, number one, when there is hordes on both sides, it's far easier to defend, it's far reversible. Plus, secondly, we're going to explain why it's also bad in the environment. They say that it's actually bad, that people will probably evolve to adjust to environments. But they never explain how they evolve and why it's likely. It's a reversible motion where you don't get to feel what it looks like. You still have to prove the likelihood of whether it will manifest. That's UADC manual and WDC manual, by the way. So I'm going to explain to you why you actually evolve worse under their side. Number one, because a lot of convergent technologies are simply like the very dry middle, is highly concentrated with less people there. What happens here is that you're probably going to be adjusting a lot of like El Niños, for example. What does it mean? You're less likely to do things in agriculture, you develop your food less, therefore less integrated in food and cuisine and culture. You build less culture and less diversity. That makes us beautiful uniquely. Secondly, because of the reason that you're also going to have to face larger typhoons, you're probably inside a bit more. You don't get to go out more and beat other people. Does actually intensify that conflict as well. Or you have less people then does people die. We're not saying you're going to get extinct, but it's far worse when you evolve like this. Don't develop your cultures on your side. Therefore, if you believe culture is beautiful, you agree with your side. If conflict is bad, you have to prove why science is false. Proud to false.
I thank you all very much. To bring is so government and now for government here.
Hi, my name is Trisha, but most of my friends call me Zara, especially from the people that I have from BPLB. Actually, the reason why I decided to join this competition is largely because I graduated from Vincent's Pilot High School as a junior high school student. So I've always wanted back to the community, especially I'm really very happy right now that I'm seeing a lot of Vincent's Pilot High School students trying to join these competitions as well. And if I can, I wish to give back. If I can, hopefully. But also shout out to Miro who said yes the moment that I asked him, and to Jill who decided to come with me. I love you guys so much. Thank you for this. In the vast majority of cases in status quo, the biggest conflicts often stem from racism, in which it exists not only because of superiority complex of certain kinds, but also precisely because of the differences people have physically and ideologically. These are things that side government already proves to have been solved in the first place. These problems often looks like one, Americans during the American colonization or occupation perceiving Filipinos as a lower being because of their complexion and their high builds. But the reason why they have these differences is precisely because of the fact that the Filipinos had to adapt to the fact that they have to climb a lot of mountains. That's why they are shorter, but precisely why they have bigger calves. Explains the difference. This explains the difference between the Filipinos and Americans at the end of the day, in which the Americans, because of the difference that they have in the Filipinos, doesn't necessarily acknowledge the benefits of having that kind of body for the Filipinos. But secondly, and I think a most important example is the problem on the Israel and Palestine conflict due to their ideological differences based on physical differences. The problem of that is precisely because of how they have differences when it comes to the places that they've been living in. They're trying to occupy this specific place because they think that they own it in the past lives. They are trying to occupy this specific place because they have the complexion, they have superiority complex on how they think that their ideologies are much more better than the other people that exist in the world. I think these are things side of the opposition does not outweigh. In order, what Oliver suggests, the separation triggered multitudes of excuses for oppression in the most destructive happenings in history. This means, in order for side opposition to win, they need to outweigh the thousands of years of racism and the irreversible harm and systems that they have, simply because the people in their side is born in the wrong place. I don't think they solved that alone. The clarification. Let me explain to you in silence because I don't think DLO is listening to the framing of my Prime Minister. How differences manifested due to the Pangaea's separation. First, tectonic plates. These are things that do not exist. Therefore, you don't have volcanoes, the mountains, and ridges, etc. That these are all the things that created geographical quirks that triggered human bodies to adapt based on the weather that we have. All of which dictates how society will treat you, especially in the years that existed side opposition that force people to oppress other people at the end of the day simply because they think I look better. This shit looks at me as well. That's why I'm not gonna treat you the same way that I want to treat the people who looks like me. In the comparative, on our worst case, it is a winning metric that comes from side government. Of course, conflicts will still exist. That's not something that we're trying to absolutely solve on. But at least on our side, they listen because the wars and conflicts that would happen inside would exist. That would exist would often stem from the practical needs, but we'll explain later on my way on the issues why it's going to be more likely on our side to be more comparable. On their best case, they assume that they don't have much conflict. But I wanted to prove how they will never happen as I weigh things out. And at least on our side, there's only one less metric of racism. It means one less reason to fight off each other at the end of the day. What's the benefit that you get from them? There's no exclusive blood comes from side opposition. Why?
What incentive do the outlanders have to share food and water with the inlanders with the fringes, aside from being kind and altruistic?
Mira already explains that if you don't have foods in the inlands, of course your body will adapt to your body will adapt and go to the places that have foods. This is the precise reason why you don't have people and most animals that can be eaten living in Antarctica. Look, it's basic science, guys. Come on. But second, on the issue of diversification, opposition comes. Try to tell us two things. Oh, we build meaningful connections in order to meet people. The distance needs to be is beautiful, and therefore we need to explore. I think we already explained why this is a problem because of the harm that we already posited on how the racism evolves at the end of the day. This means beautifully painted glass roses in opposition has to outweigh the practical and harms we paint to you, all of which exist precisely because of the differences that they do not necessarily solve to at the end of the day. I think it's quite lame. Even if you try to do it, it's going to be unfair coming from opposition. They try to tell you that also in opposition that they have the time to defend and generate, defend and generate some sort of practical, I don't know, perhaps guns to defend the civilization that they have. But I want to posit some sort of question to you. Who are you going to fight in Pangaea? Look, guys, you are the same. Why the hell are you going to be fighting each other? But I'm also going to explain why it's going to be lesser conflicts and why you're more or less likely to fight each other on the second issue. In terms of conflicts, opposition tries to win, saying that there are people in the inside who will face a lot of difficulties. Miro already explains how it's part of human evolvement or like evolution to look for places that will benefit them. Opposition tries to win by not even engaging on this. Even in the best case that they don't even actually do it, the human biology will adapt to what they need. This looks like Filipinos in certain parts of the country who does diving to catch pearls as a living develop a gear-like part of the body. Even if the problem is water resources, and this was our worst case, why is it more appealing that people are inherently the same despite being spectrum, and therefore they have the incentive to help each other? Look, it's appealing that people look the same in our side of the house because one, there's going to be much more empathy. It's the same reason why you're going to help out a struggling debater at the early days of their career as a better debater, precisely because of the psychological response that is similar to you. This means, and second, you have much more understanding to each other because you guys see each other in one single island that would therefore mean to you as a there's less reason to justify the problems. On the instance that there are problems, it's for survival, and these are things that are highly justifiable, and not because you are being discriminated because of the physical differences that you have. For all those reasons, side government takes this championship.
I thank the government for the wonderful speech to crystallize the case of opposition. Opposition, here.
I officially submitted this speech. Some of my teammates, thank you for joining me for a long ride here in people from the Olympics Marathon. And also, shout out to my girlfriend and also shout out to Jenny from Dublin. I hope I could see you there. Yeah. Sorry, my speech is there. Thanks. China and Mongolia, India and Pakistan, with all of the histories that we have, the differences that we have as a society will always dictate the ways in which we create competitive needs on the ground. But what we told you from the top of our bench is that it is the beauty of our differences that allows us to diversify the ocular of our identity. That is, the fact that Filipinos are brown, the Nigerians are black, and the Americans are white, allows us to have assortment with the way that we develop as a humanity. In fact, we already pointed out that these extreme differences are the ones that allow us to evolve to be more understanding and exercise the emotional intelligence that we need to go to a further extent. Because if you listen to what's happening right now, in the world of God, you still have different cultures and identities by the basis of who is in the inlet and who is on the outland. Problem, the marginal distinctness in their side does not beat the utmost ability of humanity to deal with the differences that we have. I.e., you're less likely to develop the familiarity that we have right now in comparison when we cross this differences. So the difference is on the extent. But we say that it is on the extent that actually matters. Because humanity in itself is still random. Allain and Joseph have already explained that based on genetics alone, even if we are on the same rate, people are just embedded with different characteristics. The fact that Lenny is a very loving leader in comparison to Sara Duterte, who curses and so-called, despite of them being both Filipinos, simply connotes that it's not just nature, it is also the nurture that dictates our differences. But here's the kicker. The reason why we have an intact and prosperous society, despite of the current geopolitical and social conflict that you experience, it's because of the mechanisms of nurtures that we have developed throughout the most extreme case of history that we have, e.g., the Civil War, the World War I, and World War II. It is the collective memory of settling our differences that allowed us to formulate what we call as horizontal pluralism. The fact that we all need each other because one country is an archipelago, one country is rich in nickel, one country is rich in oil. This universality are the ones that makes us love and need each other. The very form of real centrality that the world of government will never have. Just take a look at the comparison. Joseph and Allain collectively bantered that what you will have is vertical hierarchy on their end. But God seems to be very confused. They said that once we have a centralized world, the differences are just gone. Imperialism will never exist. Panel, if you take a look at the difference between Camarines Sur and Camarines Norte, the difference between China and Vietnam, you can see a lot of differences even if you're on the same landmass. Just because you have one landmass, that doesn't mean that the social areas of human to create different forms of cultures will never exist. Just because China and Vietnam are near to each other, that doesn't mean that they share the same weather and resources. And that is the problem. If the differences that you have within the status quo is very extreme, what you have in their world is just worse. When people with an outlet can skirt the access to water, which equates to the access to rich plants and resources, since these are the most critical subsistence for your populace. But God said that access to waters are not that important. Tell that to the people who needed spice, salt, and chemical resources to sustain permanence in our society. Problem, I want to ask what stops people from blocking these sites in order for them to retain control, just like what Allain and Joseph pointed out. Just because Saudi Arabia has sands and has access to water, that does stop people from inhabiting that land. No, its scarcity is just extremely harsh in their world. Since by their own words, people might not move and utilize this landmass that we could have had otherwise. But this further proves the point. This means that people will have the reason to prevent each other from accessing useful resources because it is scarce. Because you have a large landmass that you will not utilize. BYD.
So again, we don't say imperialism doesn't happen on our side. We say that it's harder to justify. Wars still exist on our side, but they're harder to justify. They're not like driven by like difference in
The
skin tone.
differences I'm already explaining right now. We will have differences because of the critical resources that you're going to block because it is scarce, and literally that's probably the word of your leader of your prime minister. No, what we point out is human in itself, as a social animal, knows that a neglected landmass does not mean equally usable land. By the basis of our survival instinct, we are incentivized to be selfish. We will always prioritize the control of our subsistence via proximity. That is what we point out to be vertical hierarchy. If you think that differences will just stop just because we have one land mass, that's just crazy. That means that people from the outland will create one of the most ridiculous hierarchy to prevent each other from outtaking most critical resources from them. We all want control, since it is with control that we sustain ourselves. So I'm not quite sure why the people from the outer south or outer south or the outer north will just have the incentive of camaraderie to share resources that would lead you to like I don't know, maybe sharing like the access to this and that. But the problem is they won't have they won't have that camaraderie simply because the resources that you have is simply scarce, and all it will also lead to the suffering of the other if you outtake these resources. No, this is the problem when land takes the same characteristic. You don't have any leverage or reason to get into the middle ground and cooperate. Only comparative. That is just far worse. You cannot just assert that people will suddenly love each other when insecurity to the same ground are met. And you don't need to read the UADC manual for that because that is a prerequisite of MET. This is just debate 101. No, you can still see the differences within Chinese population, for instance, where color still varies if they are on the mainland, etc. But the boundaries and borders that you will settle in their world is just minuscule and ridiculous. That means you will never have enough room to know why the extreme ends of humanity deserves to see each other in the middle ground. The fact that God assumes that we will evolve to settle the differences that we have just because it is a world reset simply proves that they don't have any preemptive mechanism from their first. You can just assert a model, it's your job to mechanize that world from your first. It's also within the UABC manual. Let's just use this their favorite world. It is a world reset. And this world reset is simply bad. Just take a look at the numbers of deaths during the wars initiated by Mongolians within the same landmass. If you compete for the same resources over and over again, you will just live in a world where people will have incentives to savage each other. That simply means that those who are native on the outland will always view settlers as second-rate citizens, even if they do settle within that land. They will think that you're stealing resources from them. You're stealing the future of their kids. This means that physical differences will still happen in their side, and birth lottery is decided on who's born within the outland. What do you get on our side? You get the international supervision of each other. We know that we have to intervene to Israel and Palestine conflict because we view each other as important. We view each culture as critical, as part of our identity, because it's the differences that we have that formulates our view of humanity. That just simply means that it is in our world where the moment that you are born, you are special.
Okay, I think we saw opposition then. To conclude the case of the bench, opposition required. Thank you.
Hello, hello. Sorry. Hello. Okay. Life as we live it is imperfect, but I would never ask any other life than one my own. I'm going to explain to you here is simple and explain the burdens of proof government had to explain to you in order to win and why they failed to do so, comparatively what burdens of proof we explain to you, and lastly, we'll explain the metrics of judging you can use this debate. Firstly, in order for you to believe their argument or their speeches, you have to explain, you have to believe that the fee that they have expands into the outcome that they actually claim. The problem here is that when you play things like evolution would happen, sure, it would happen. The problem is what outcome does the evolution work? You have to illustrate it, not just a one-liner. Therefore, I agree. Logically, you guys make sense. Like, of course. But the problem is that the depth of analysis we are trying to ask here. Did you analyze these empirical claims like how scientific evolution works, or how melanin works, or how the shape of the earth affects where you live, for example, in your genetics? I think to some extent, logically they make sense. And this is me being very tired. But unfortunately, team opposition here was just far deeper in how they analyze things. But the problem here is that notice they never engage on our empirical or like intuition talks about the kingdom of Rome or dynastic China, where these are actual territories that are not divided by water, but still far very violent. Therefore, if you want to believe them, you have to ignore things like Rome and China for that to be true. But to some extent, it's true. I guess it does true. There will be conflict on our side, and that's where we're conceding to the most charitable extent. I do agree that Israel Palestine was really bad. But we don't use that on our side. The extent is simple. Because Israel Palestine was divided in not simply one land regionally, they had to immigrate. The fact that it took time for them to actually be able to conquest or actually colonize Palestine is what made Palestine still exist in the first place because they had some resources to defend themselves. That's the extent of the defense that we told you. Notice, they never responded to the idea about the length of defense we can prepare for or how much differences can be marked to still exist. Therefore, on engagement, they're also losing when we're trying to respond to every case that they are able to display. Lastly, the last assumption you have to believe them is say, there's little no division that is on their side. I told you, even if you're from the same landmass, some people be gay, some people be black or white because of higher position on relative the equator. You're still 100 kilometers away from each other, and scarcity resources to those who are in the shores are still existing. They're still competing against your own differences. But I agree, it's hard to justify discrimination on your best case. The question is, what does it empirically mean as far as justify discrimination? Different ideologies justify it, still discrimination, right? But on our side, regardless of how subjective that justification is, you have something objective. You can defend yourself at the same time. You can make sure that they cannot simply just use the wheel, for example, they have never responded to be able to conquer everything before it even started. You can't be a land because it never did it 10, 100 years earlier. All right, 3 reasons why we win. Firstly, we win on depth of analysis. But where they're logically true, or it logically makes sense to some extent, with some fiat, the most will happen. Unfortunately, the logic were one-liners. Things like evolution will happen, for example, or that the margins of discrimination is what exists. We don't need the specifics of this and how the depth analysis explains what difference of discrimination exists on our side and what kind of beauty the difference made. But secondly, we also win on charitability. Their side likes to accuse that we're not going to the new ADC manual or that maybe on our side these things don't exist. We told you, yes, your argument makes sense, but here's the problem with your best case, right? That's the trend that we had. They never engage with things like the wheel as conquest tool, for example, therefore uncharitable. Lastly, thirdly, on empiricism. Notice they never use empirical reasons to justify their things. Like, for example, not I'm just saying like styles for examples, obviously, that's way up broad. But saying things like scientific facts, like the Allain theory, how it affects things, or how Pangaea-centric is oftentimes a job then. Therefore, they're also less empirical as a result, less reason to believe them. Lastly, very simple. Breadth analysis. They stick to one argument of conflict, never engage how the possibility of massive super typhoons, how this affects your future as well. Proud to propose opposing.
Thank the opposition speech. The panel to the round of government reply. Here.
Depth of analysis doesn't matter if it's irrelevant. Just a quick look at Jill's speech, and you can check your notes in the recording as well. Jill immediately says that Caucasians, etc., for example, will still exist in variants of like skin color, but the difference in status quo is that they were unable to mingle and they have no concept of the fact that there are other people as themselves because they have been geographically isolated. On our side, yes, skin tones exist. But the fact that they were able to mingle with each other means that they are just like us. We are the same because they are connected by one landmass. On their side, the white people has evolved differently because there is a Mediterranean Sea across African nations at the very end of the day. The second thing I want to point out is the fact that yes, we have differences, but the fact that we were able to meet them on opposition, they were physically isolated. But second is the fact that they keep imposing status quo standards in a world reset motion. An example is harsher climates. Yes, we need agriculture, better agriculture and climate to feed 8 billion people in status quo. But then why would we have to feed 8 billion people on our side of the house using their own logic? Then we have to feed less people on our side. They don't explain why we have suddenly 8 billion people that we have to feed on our side. Obviously, again, using basic logic, if the environment is incapable of feeding 8 billion people, then there will inherently just be less people on our side. How? They don't explain why the same logic that we have in status quo, the same metrics, is equally important on our side of the house, such as spices. They said that spices were important, but spices were just connected on our side of the house precisely because everything is connected, as we said. But second, it's the fact that they keep contradicting themselves. LO says you have unitary government. DLO says that there are probably differences. But then government opposition group says that actually it's going to be a unitary government, but then they start meeting on each other, etc. You cannot necessarily buy all of these claims altogether. But lastly, and this is the most important part, is on weighing. They keep saying things like vertical hierarchy, vertical inequality, wars will still exist. We conceded to this. We said that wars will still exist on our side of the house, like scarcity, for example. But what we explain is that these things are justifiable because both sides are fair. They're fighting for resources. On their side, it's easier to weaponize this and make wars bloodier. You have an ulterior motive to kill as opposed to, hey guys, it's just business. We need this to survive. So if it's about extents that they want to talk about, then wars exist. But the extent of which that they're more destructive is much more on opposition. They keep saying that wars will still coexist on our side of the house because differences exist. What we and Zali immediately proves is that we have one less reason to fight about. We have one less reason why we fight about. We don't explain why vertical hierarchy doesn't exist on their side of the house. We were able to explain why people have one less reason to fight, and this one reason just so happens to amplify racism, which is detrimental. No, they said that diversity allowed us to understand to each other. They justify the problem of racism about the hundreds of people that has been killed by structural prejudice and racism by saying that we'll eventually hold our hands and sing kumbaya. But lastly, outlanders versus inlanders. They see one metric of racism, outlanders versus inlanders. But second, given the most charitable, they explain two metrics of racism, different skin tone and outlanders versus inlanders. On their side, the differences in culture, the differences, the fact that we're both white, but the fact that you live in like Scandinavia versus in Northern Europe, you're different. These are things. So basically, by counting, we have less reason to fight one another. We have less reason to be much more hostile towards each other. That's the main reason why opposition loses. They don't weigh. Yes, wars will still exist on our side, but to what extent? We have less of it because it's harder to justify racism and things that are morally important towards humans.
That concludes the second Angat Kabataan. Oh my God, final things let's give them a round of applause. As we perform, and I invite my panelists for the deliberations.